The Comet tank, or tank cruiser, Comet I was a British cruiser tank that first saw use near the end of the Second World War. It was designed as an improvement on the earlier Cromwell tank, mounting the 77mm HV gun in a new lower profile and part-cast turret. This gun was effective against late-war German tanks, including the Panther and, at most ranges, the Tiger. The tank was widely respected as one of the best British tanks of the war, and continued in service afterwards. Comet, which was a development of the Cromwell, rendered the Challenger obsolete, and led to the development of the Centurion tank. When firing APDS rounds, the 77mm HV was a superior weapon to the 75mm KWK-42 gun of the equivalent Axis tank, the Panther. The Comet saw action in the closing stages of the Second World War, saw post-war combat during the Korean War, and remained in British service until 1958. In some cases, Comets sold to other countries continued to operate into the 1980s. Design and development. Background: combat experience against the Germans in the Western Desert Campaign demonstrated to the British many shortcomings with the cruiser tanks. Hence, a request was made in 1941 for a new heavy cruiser tank that could achieve battle superiority over German models. For reasons of economy and efficiency, it had to use as many components as possible from the current A-15 cruiser tank Mk Crusader tank. The initial designs for the new Cromwell tank evolved into the A-24 cruiser tank Mk7 Cavalier tank and the A-27L cruiser tank Mk7 Centaur tank, both powered by the Nuffield Liberty. Design progressed through the cruiser tank Mk7 Cromwell, a third parallel development to the Cavalier and Centaur, sharing many of the same characteristics. Under the newer A27M specification, Cromwell integrated a number of new and advanced features. The new Meteor engine proved to be very reliable and gave the tank good mobility, but some problems appeared based on the vehicle's shared heritage and significant jump in engine power. The tank was prone to throwing its tracks if track tension was not maintained properly or if it turned at too high a speed or too sharply. There were also some problems with suspension breakage, partly due to the Cromwell's high speed. Cromwell ran through a number of design changes as a result. Most notably, however, the Cromwell tank's inherited turret design could not mount the intended 75mm high-velocity gun, and remained with the standard 75mm similar to that of the Sherman. A more powerful 17-pounder armed tank, the A-30 cruiser Mk8 Challenger tank, was developed. Based on the Cromwell, the hull had to be lengthened and a much larger turret set on top to mount the larger gun. Conversion of Sherman tanks to the Sherman Firefly was significantly faster than Challenger production, however, and driven by operational needs of the Normandy invasion, production of Challenger was dropped. Fireflies provided additional firepower to Cromwell and Sherman armed troops. One Firefly would be issued to each troop of Cromwell's, but this was unsatisfactory. Problems were encountered due to the different maintenance requirements and associated supply complication of two tank models, as well as the performance difference between Cromwell and Sherman and the Sherman's larger silhouette. The large size and obvious difference of both Challenger and Firefly made them a priority target for Axis forces. Tank cruiser Comet L with the A-34, later named Comet. The tank designers opted to correct some of the Cromwell's flaws in armament and build while building upon the Cromwell's main strengths: low height, high speed and mobility. This replaced the need for Challenger and Firefly, and acted upon the experiences gained through design and early deployment of Cromwell. Originally, it had been expected that Cromwell would use a new gun from Vickers, the high-velocity 75mm. However, as designed, the gun would not fit into the turret size available. Development of the gun continued, and as work commenced on the Comet, the gun design evolved into the 77mm HV. The gun now used the same caliber projectile as the 17-pounder, but the cartridge case was from the older QF 3-inch 20 hundredweight anti-aircraft gun loaded to higher pressures. The resulting round was completely different from 17-pounder ammunition. The 77mm HV had a lower muzzle velocity than the ordnance QF 17-pounder on Challenger and Firefly, but the ammunition was much more compact and more easily stored and handled within the tank. This made it possible to mount the gun on a smaller turret ring. The Challenger turret had been so large to allow space for two loaders, without making the hull wider. Several other improvements were made over the Cromwell's original design, and many of its design revisions were incorporated, such as safety hatches for both driver and hull gunner. The hull was now fully welded as standard, and armor was increased, ranged from 32mm to 74mm on the hull, while the turret was from 57 to 102mm. A new lower profile welded turret was created using a cast gun mantled for the 77mm. The turret was electrically traversed, with a generator powered by the main engine rather than the hydraulic system of the Cromwell. Ammunition for the 77mm gun was stored in armored bins. Comet's suspension was strengthened, and track return rollers were added. As with later Cromwells, the Comet tank stop speed was limited from the Cromwell's 40+ mph to a slower, but respectable 32 miles per hour. This change preserved the lifespan of suspension and engine components and reduced track wear. Similar to later Churchill's, Comet benefited from lessons learned in the cooperation of tanks with infantry. It was fitted as standard with two radio sets, a wireless set number 19 for communication with the regiment and the troop, and a No. 38 wireless for communication with infantry units. Like many British tanks, it also had a telephone handset mounted on the rear so that accompanying infantry could talk to the crew. Production. Comet tanks were built by a number of British firms led by Leyland, including English Electric, John Fowler and Amp Co., and Metro Camel. The mild steel prototype was ready in February 1944 and entered trials. Concerns about the hull gun and belly armor were put to one side to avoid redesign, but there was still sufficient delay caused by minor modifications and changes. Production models did not commence delivery until September 1944. Comet was intended to be in service by December 1944, but crew training was delayed by the German Ardennes offensive. By the end of the war, 1,200 had been produced. Service history. Second World War. The British 11th Armoured Division was the first formation to receive the new tanks. Deliveries commenced in December 1944, and the only division to be completely refitted by the end of the war. Due to its late arrival in the war in Northwest Europe, the Comet did not participate in big battles, although it was used in combat. The Comet was involved in the crossing of the Rhine and the later Berlin Victory Parade in July 1945. The Comet's maximum speed of 32 miles per hour was greatly exploited on the German autobahns. Post-war era. During the following Korean War, the Comet served alongside the heavier Centurion tank, a successor introduced in the closing days of the Second World War on an experimental basis but too late to see combat. The Centurion was formally adopted in 1949 and was partly based on the Comet design. The Comet remained in British service until 1958, when the remaining tanks were sold to foreign governments. Up until the 1980s, it was used by the armies of various nations such as South Africa, which maintained several as modified recovery vehicles. Two examples were still being held in reserve by the South African Army as late as 2000. 41 Comet Mki Model Bs were also used by Finnish Defence Forces Armoured Brigade until 1970. The tanks were stored until 2007, when 4 of them were auctioned. 4 Comets were delivered to the Irish Army in 1959 and a further 4 in 1960. Severe budget cutbacks affected the service lives of the Comets, as not enough spares were purchased. The Comet appealed to the Irish Army as it was cheap to buy and run, had low ground pressure and good anti-tank capability. However, faulty fuses meant the withdrawal of the HE ammunition, which limited the tank's role to an anti-tank vehicle. With stocks of 77mm ammunition dwindling in 1969, the Army began an experiment to prolong the life of the vehicle. It involved replacing the turret with an open mounting with the Bofors 90mm PV-111, a recoilless rifle. The project was cancelled due to lack of funds. The last 77mm Comet shoot was in 1973 and the tanks were withdrawn soon afterwards. 1 is preserved in the Curragh camp and 2 more survive in other barracks. Operators: Cuba, Finland, Ireland, South Africa, United Kingdom, Myanmar. Variants: Comet had 2 hull versions, Model A with exhaust exiting the top rear of the vehicle using a Norman decal similar to Cromwell. Model B, a post-war update with twin fishtail exhausts exiting the rear armor. Other vehicles were based upon the Comet Crocodile. One surviving photo reveals the existence of the Comet Crocodile. This mounted a flamethrower and pressurized trailer similar to the Churchill Crocodile. Little is known about it. FV-4401 contentious. The Comet was used as the basis for the experimental FV-4401 contentious, a self-propelled air-transportable anti-tank gun mounting a 105mm L7 gun in an open mounting on the shortened hull of a Comet, and using the vehicle's hydraulic suspension system to adjust elevation, similar to the method used on the Swedish S-tank. 1 or 2 prototypes were built and tested before the project was cancelled.